Deep within the frost-bitten stretches of the outer rim, where the starlight fades into a permanent, suffocating twilight, the Coalition Defense Compact maintained a terrified silence regarding a single vessel. Known across encrypted military channels simply as Hull Registry 404, or more commonly by the whispers of desperate refugees as the Nightingale, it was a ship that defied every rule of interstellar architecture. It did not carry the sleek, polished armor of the Athari dreadnoughts, nor did it boast the raw, industrial bulk of early human cargo haulers. It was an unpainted, matte charcoal wedge of high-density composite steel, scarred by micrometeorite impacts and thermal burns from the edge of dying suns. To the high admirals sitting comfortably in the inner core sectors, the ship was an anomaly, a rogue element that operated entirely outside the jurisdiction of intergalactic maritime law. Yet, to those trapped in the immediate path of the encroaching void, it was the only name whispered when all hope had evaporated into the cold vacuum of space. The interior of the Nightingale mirrored its exterior, functional, ascetic, and utterly devoid of comfort. There were no grand observation domes, no luxurious offices quarters, and no echoing mess halls filled with the chatter of a large crew. Instead, the corridors hummed with the low, monotonous drone of atmospheric scrubbers and redundant power grids, smelling faintly of ozone and old machine oil. At any given moment, the ship operated with a skeleton crew of precisely 2 individuals, a statistical impossibility for a vessel rated for long-range deep space operations. They lived in a perpetual state of hyper-readiness, their quarters little more than reinforced alcoves flanking the primary bridge. For months on end, the ship would drift ghost-like through unmapped sectors, its transponder scrambled, intentionally hiding from both enemy fleets and friendly patrols alike. It was a machine built for one singular purpose, waiting patiently in the dark for the exact mathematical second when a world stopped spinning and reality began to fracture. On the flight deck, Captain Christopher "Kit" Vance sat slumped in the primary command harness, his eyes bloodshot and fixed on a rolling cascade of temporal telemetry. His fingers danced across the physical, tactile keys of a secondary console, overriding an automated diagnostic that kept throwing false positives due to radiation leakage. Across the narrow well of the bridge, First Officer Lena Park didn't look up from her primary data slate, her thumbs flicking through complex gravitational models that predicted spatial collapses weeks before they manifested physically. Neither spoke. Conversation between them had long since devolved into shorthand glances and subtle shifts in posture. They didn't need words to communicate the weight of what they carried. They were the caretakers of the end times, the scavengers of lost epochs, watching the grand tapestry of the galaxy unravel thread by thread while the rest of civilization blindly celebrated hollow victories in the core worlds. The crisis began not with a thunderous explosion or an invading armada, but with a silent, agonizing drop in atmospheric pressure across the entire planetary network of Sector 9. A prominent Valen research colony, nestled against the event horizon of a dormant supermassive anomaly, had underestimated the rate of spatial decay. For 3 standard cycles, the station's automated distress beacon had pulsed a weak, fragmented cry for help, bouncing uselessly off dead relay satellites before finally catching the long-range passive sensors of the Nightingale. On the bridge, the primary tactical map flickered to life, bathing Kit and Lena in an eerie crimson glow as the severity of the Valen predicament mapped itself across the main display. The colony was sinking slowly into a gravity well from which no standard propulsion system could escape, its structural integrity groaning under the sheer, unyielding weight of compressed spacetime. Lena's fingers froze over her console as she cross-referenced the distress code with planetary demographic logs. Over 4 million sentient life forms are still registered within the primary habitat rings, she murmured, her voice carrying the flat, clinical detachment of someone who had calculated the math of mass extinction too many times before. If we deploy standard rescue vectors, our hull will be crushed by the tidal forces within 48 minutes. The evacuation corridors are already folding in on themselves. Kid did not look up immediately, he simply reached out and dialed the ship's inertial dampeners up to maximum capacity, knowing full well the physical toll it would take on their own bodies once they crossed the threshold. He had spent his entire adult life making choices where every available option was agonizingly wrong, leaving him to select only the least catastrophic path among ruins. Without a word of hesitation, Kit hauled back on the main throttle, initiating a blind, uncalculated microjump that bypassed standard interstellar transit lanes entirely. The Nightingale shuddered violently, its exterior plates shrieking in protest as spatial currents battered the vessel like waves against a solitary cliffside. Inside the cockpit, the gravity generators flickered, throwing both officers hard against their harness straps as the ship pierced the outer perimeter of Sector 9. When the viewports finally cleared, the sight that met them was nothing short of apocalyptic. The massive Valen research station hung suspended in the abyss like a shattered glass sculpture, its lights winking out one by one as the surrounding space began to warp and distort under the immense gravitational pressure of the collapsing anomaly. Docking with a dying space station while gravity itself was tearing its framework apart required a level of reckless precision that defied every protocol taught in coalition naval academies. Kit manually overrode the Nightingale's automated magnetic docking clamps, opting instead for a high-impact, kinetic seal that wedged their starboard airlock directly into the reinforced emergency bay of the Valen habitat. Sparks cascaded across the bridge viewports as metal ground against metal, the screech of tearing composite armor vibrating through the deck plates beneath their boots. Dressed in heavy, unpolished EVA suits that bore no national insignia or unit patches, Kit and Lena blew the internal hatch, stepping out from the sanctuary of their own ship and directly into the chaotic, freezing gloom of the doomed research facility. The interior of the station was a ghost town of terror and abandonment. Automated emergency lights cast long, frantic shadows across corridors littered with dropped equipment, abandoned research notes, and the eerie, crystalline remains of shattered life support terminals. Valen survivors, tall, frail beings with skin like polished obsidian and eyes wide with primal panic, huddled in the central concourse, having long since given up hope of rescue. When Kit and Lena stepped through the pressurized bulkhead, their weapons lowered but their stances radiating an undeniable aura of absolute, terrifying competence, the room fell dead silent. The contrast between the shivering, weeping aliens and the two stoic humans was stark. While the Valen looked like victims trapped at the end of history, Kit and Lena moved like executioners of fate who had walked through identical nightmares 100 times before. Lena immediately set to work bypassing the security lockdown on the primary personnel elevators, her hacking tool hissing as it melted through heavy titanium blast doors with focused plasma bursts. Kit swept the perimeter, his assault rifle held at a low, ready position, eyes scanning every darkened intersection and flickering ceiling vent with cold, methodical efficiency. He did not offer comforting platitudes or false promises of safety. He simply pointed toward the umbilical airlock connecting the station to the Nightingale and barked short, unmistakable orders in a voice that commanded obedience through sheer weight of authority. "Move now," he told the lead Valen administrator, whose hands shook violently as he tried to herd his traumatized people toward the exit. "The gravity well is shifting faster than predicted. You have 12 minutes before this entire sector ceases to exist." As the last of the Valen survivors were sealed safely within the heavily fortified cargo bays of the Nightingale, Lena remained behind in the station's central data core for a few crucial moments. While Kit secured the airlock seal, she pried open the main mainframe housing, extracting several glowing, crystalline data drives that contained the entire historical, cultural, and scientific output of the doomed civilization. She slid the drives into a specialized, lead-lined containment pouch strapped securely to her thigh, her expression completely unreadable beneath her tinted helmet visor. To an outside observer, spending precious seconds pillaging data libraries while a station was collapsing might have seemed callous or absurd. But to Lena, it was the most sacred duty the human race had assumed since the dawn of their expansion into deep space. Back aboard the Nightingale, the atmosphere was thick with the nervous, suffocating energy of 4 million newly rescued refugees packed into spaces designed for a handful. As Kit maneuvered the ship away from the decaying debris field of Sector 9, the Valen administrator approached the bridge bulkhead, staring in disbelief at the tiny, cramped control room that had somehow orchestrated their salvation. "You risked your lives, and your ship, for a colony that was already written off by our own High Council," the alien said, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound gratitude and lingering shock. "Why? The compact military abandoned us days ago. What compels humans to fly into the furnace when everyone else runs away?" Kid didn't turn away from his navigation console, his fingers steadily adjusting the fuel injection ratios for their jump home. "The compact calculates acceptable losses based on tactical projections and political capital," Kid replied flatly, his tone devoid of any patriotic fervor or performative bravado. "We don't calculate losses at all. When a civilization goes dark, someone has to make sure they aren't forgotten. That is the entire purpose of the Nightingale." The administrator stared at the human captain for a long moment, realizing with a sudden, chilling clarity that the humans weren't rescuing them out of simple kindness. They were acting as the cosmic historians of a dying universe, sweeping up the final, fragile echoes of erased species before the dark devoured them forever. Back at the Coalition's primary naval staging base on Station Meridian, reports of the Nightingale's unauthorized rescue operation sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of military command. Chief Arbiter Solon, a towering, multi-limbed luminary of the Athari delegation, slammed his primary appendage down onto the polished obsidian conference table, shattering a holographic projection of Sector 9's collapse. "This human vessel operates entirely outside our command structure," Solon bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted titanium ceilings of the briefing chamber. "They routinely ignore quarantine protocols, refuse standard inspections, and flout every established maritime law in the Compact Charter. If they are harboring unregistered refugees and unknown data artifacts from collapsing sectors, they represent a severe security risk to all member species." Seated quietly near the back of the room, Human Ambassador Marcus Vance listened to the tirade with a mask of weary indifference. He had heard these complaints countless times before from aliens who could not comprehend the quiet, crushing burden humanity had quietly taken upon its shoulders. "The Nightingale is an auxiliary vessel, Arbiter," Marcus replied smoothly, cutting through the murmurs of the assembled admirals with an unnerving calm. "Its crew answers to a directive issued by Earth Command long before our species ever joined your little coalition. If you wish to recall them, feel free to send one of your pristine dreadnoughts into the gravity well of a dying star to do their job. I am certain your captains will find the experience enlightening." The conference room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. None of the alien commanders volunteered to chase the Nightingale into the dark. They all knew the terrifying reputation the ship carried. They knew that while the Coalition built grand armadas to fight wars they were slowly losing, humanity had quietly engineered a fleet of ghost ships designed for something much darker and more necessary: picking up the pieces after the fighting was already over. Solon scowled, his multiple eyes narrowing in bitter resentment, but he said nothing further. The Compact needed humanity's industrial output and their terrifying, unshakable resilience on the front lines, which meant they had to tolerate the phantom ship that haunted the edges of their maps, operating by rules no one else dared to understand. Deep within her private quarters aboard the Nightingale, away from the watchful eyes of the rescued refugees and the demanding telemetry of the bridge, First Officer Lena Park faced her own personal ghosts. The overhead light was dimmed to a faint, amber glow, casting long shadows across a bulkhead lined not with military commendations or tactical maps, but with thousands of tiny, glowing digital thumbnails, each one representing a lost world, a dead sun, or a civilization that had been completely erased from the cosmic record. She stared at a holographic projection of a blue-green planet that no longer existed on any galactic star chart, her fingers tracing the contour of a coastline that had been vaporized by an ancient, nameless war long before humanity ever built its first warp drive. A soft chime at her door interrupted her solitude, and Kit stepped into the tiny cabin without waiting for an invitation. He didn't ask what she was looking at, he already knew. He had seen that exact hollow, distant expression on her face 100 times before, usually in the quiet hours immediately following a brutal rescue operation. "Another sector report just came in from the outer rim," Kit said quietly, leaning against the cold metal doorframe with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. A localized spatial tear is forming near the fringe of the Perseus arm. Initial projections suggest an entire mining colony will be swallowed within 24 hours. Earth Command has given us clearance to deploy, but they reminded us of the usual protocols. Extract the data, save who we can, and leave no trace of our origin. Lena slowly turned away from the wall of lost worlds, her eyes meeting Kit's with a profound, bone-deep weariness that transcended physical exhaustion. "Do you ever wonder what happens to all those memories, Kit?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the life support ducts. "We pull them out of the fire, we store them in these vaults, and we hide them from a galaxy that doesn't even care enough to look. Sometimes it feels like we aren't rescuers at all. We're just the caretakers of a massive cosmic graveyard, waiting for our own turn to be buried." Kit walked over, placing a heavy, reassuring hand on her shoulder, feeling the slight tremor that she tried so desperately to hide from the rest of the universe. "We aren't a graveyard, Lena," he said firmly. "We are the proof that they existed. And as long as the Nightingale flies, no one gets to delete them from history." 3 days later, the Nightingale dropped out of faster-than-light transit directly into the Perseus arm, emerging into a scene of utter devastation. The mining colony of New Carthage, a sprawling network of asteroid-anchored habitats and orbital refineries, was being systematically shredded by an expanding, unnatural anomaly that looked like a jagged tear in the fabric of space itself. The colony's automated defense grids were firing blindly into the empty void, overwhelmed by intense gravitational shear forces that were ripping the habitat rings apart from the inside out. As the tiny, unpainted human ship drifted silently into the hazard zone, its passive sensors picked up a horrifying reality. The anomaly was not merely collapsing naturally. It was expanding at an exponential rate, actively hunting down and consuming every communication relay in the sector to prevent anyone from sounding the alarm. On the bridge, Kit's knuckles turned white as he fought to keep the Nightingale stable against the ferocious gravitational tides. "We've walked right into a temporal sinkhole," Lena warned, her fingers flying across her console as she calculated their escape vectors and found them all blocked by intersecting waves of distorted spacetime. "The anomaly's event horizon is shifting faster than our warp drive can cycle. If we attempt to jump out now without a clear trajectory, the spatial shear will tear our hull into subatomic particles before we even clear the asteroid belt." The tactical display flashed an angry, pulsing crimson as a massive chunk of a shattered refinery drifted dangerously close to their starboard bow, forcing Kit to execute a violent, manual evasive maneuver that threw both officers against their harnesses. Before they could even catch their breath, the ship's primary communication array crackled to life, piercing the heavy silence of the bridge with a harsh, static-laden distress call. It wasn't an automated beacon this time, but a frantic human voice belonging to the colony's lead administrator, screaming over the sound of blaring alarms and tearing metal. "This is New Carthage Command. To any ship receiving this, do not approach. The anomaly is eating our telemetry. We are locked behind a gravitational bulkhead, and the extraction ports are completely crushed. If you come in here, you aren't going to rescue us, you're just going to die with us." Kit stared at the main viewscreen, watching the shattered remains of the mining colony burn against the blackness of space, and without a single moment of hesitation, he reached out and locked their manual steering controls directly onto the doomed station's primary docking ring. The rescue operation at New Carthage pushed the Nightingale and its two-person crew to the absolute brink of human endurance. While Kit held the battered ship steady against the howling gales of spatial distortion using raw, manual thruster inputs, Lena suited up and ventured out into the crumbling airlocks alone, wielding a heavy industrial plasma cutter to carve an escape route through 4 feet of reinforced alloy. The miners trapped inside were panicked, exhausted, and completely convinced they were staring into the face of certain death. Yet, as Lena cut through the final bulkhead and pulled the heavy blast doors open, her calm, unshakable demeanor cut through the chaos like a beacon of absolute certainty. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She simply grabbed the nearest injured miner by the shoulder, pointed toward the umbilical corridor leading to the Nightingale, and said the only words that mattered: "Move." Now, back on the bridge, the situation deteriorated from perilous to catastrophic. A massive secondary shockwave from the collapsing asteroid cluster slammed into the starboard side of the Nightingale, blowing out 3 primary shield generators and knocking out the secondary navigation computer. Alarms wailed a deafening rhythm as warning lights flashed blindingly across the control panels. Across the open comm link from the Coalition Fleet Command, a frantic voice belonging to an Athari liaison officer broke through the static, screaming orders that made no sense given their tactical reality. Nightingale, this is Fleet Command. The anomaly is expanding beyond safe containment parameters. You are ordered to abandon the rescue operation immediately. Turn the ship around and retreat to secondary coordinates at once. Kid Vance stared at the flashing red warning lights, a bitter, humorless smile touching the corners of his mouth. He looked out the reinforced viewport at the terrified, exhausted miners pouring into his ship's cargo hold, and then out toward the swirling, endless abyss of the collapsing sector. He reached over the console, disabled the emergency communication link to Fleet Command entirely, and spoke into the open mic of his command headset with a quiet, devastating finality. Tell the admirals they can keep their safe coordinates, Kit said softly, his voice echoing across the silent bridge. There is no back left to turn to. We are the Nightingale. We are the only ship that never turned back. With a fierce, defiant roar of her thrusters, the tiny unpainted vessel drove straight into the heart of the anomaly, choosing to face the end head-on rather than run away from it. Inside the cargo bay of the Nightingale, the air grew biting cold as the ship's thermal regulators struggled to cope with the immense radiation leaking from the collapsing anomaly. The miners and colonists they had rescued sat huddled together in the dim emergency lighting, clinging to one another in silent terror as the ship groaned and shuddered under forces that should have torn a vessel 10 times its size into ribbons. Up on the bridge, Kid and Lena fought a desperate, losing battle against the laws of physics. The primary power core was running at 400% capacity, screaming as raw plasma flooded the containment chambers. Every console sparked and smoked, filling the small cabin with the acrid stench of melted wiring and ozone. Lena looked down at her data slate, her face pale as she realized the horrifying mathematical truth of their situation. The mass of the rescued civilians, combined with the weight of the historical data archives she had salvaged, had tipped their overall displacement past the critical threshold required for standard warp translation. Kit, she said, her voice unusually steady, carrying the quiet acceptance of someone who had looked into the abyss and finally understood its shape. The ship can't make the jump with all of us on board. The mass ratio is off by precisely 12%. If we don't jettison the primary drive core and lock the manual navigation helm from the inside, the anomaly will catch the entire cargo bay before we clear the event horizon. Kid didn't even blink. He looked at the reflection of his own exhausted face in the cracked glass of the main viewscreen, thinking of all the worlds they had saved, all the history they had preserved in the dark, and all the terrified voices they had pulled back from the edge of oblivion. Lock the navigational helm on a blind vector straight toward home, Kid instructed quietly, his fingers resting firmly on the manual override lever. Get down into the cargo hold with the civilians, Lena. Make sure those data drives make it back to Earth Command. Lena froze, her eyes widening in sudden, sharp horror as she realized what he was about to do. No, she gasped, stepping toward him. We do this together, Kit. We don't leave people behind. Kid offered her a slow, tired smile, his thumb pressing the final, irreversible sequence that sealed the bridge bulkheads from the inside out. The Nightingale never turns back, Lena, he whispered as the automatic locking mechanisms hissed shut between them. Someone always has to hold the helm until the very last second. 3 weeks after the disaster at the Perseus Arm, the battered, unpainted hull of the Nightingale dropped out of warp transit with a gentle, ghost-like sigh right outside the orbital docks of Earth Command Station Alpha. Its exterior armor was scorched black by temporal radiation, its starboard maneuvering thrusters were completely dead, and its primary bridge had been hermetically sealed from the inside, stripped of all active life signs save for the automated distress beacon humming quietly in the forward communications bay. When security teams boarded the vessel and forced open the reinforced bulkheads of the cargo hold, they found thousands of Valen and human refugees safe, warm, and alive, cradling the pristine, lead-lined containment pouches filled with the irreplaceable historical archives of a dozen lost civilizations. Word of the ship's return spread through the interstellar community like wildfire, triggering an unprecedented wave of reverence and sorrow across every member species of the Coalition. Even Chief Arbiter Solon, standing before the assembled High Council on Station Meridian, lowered his primary appendages in a rare gesture of profound, silent respect when the final mission logs of the Nightingale were broadcast across the Grand Assembly Hall. The logs did not contain grand speeches or heroic battle cries. They contained only the cold, unvarnished telemetry of a ship that had refused to run away, and the quiet, steady voice of a captain who had chosen to lock himself inside a dying bridge so that others might live to see another sunrise. The Coalition finally understood what humanity had known all along. True courage was not found in the grand parades of victorious armadas, but in the quiet, agonizing choice to stand between the innocent and the dark when no one else was left to watch. Back on Earth, inside a secure, subterranean vault far removed from the political machinations of the Compact, Ambassador Marcus Vance stood alongside First Officer Lena Park before a newly unveiled memorial wall. Etched deeply into the polished black granite were the names of every soul who had fallen in the line of duty, crowned at the top by the single, unyielding registry number of a ship that had proven what humanity was truly capable of when pushed to the absolute edge. Lena reached out, her fingers gently tracing the cold letters of Kid Vance's name carved into the stone, feeling the lingering weight of a war that had demanded everything they had to give. The Nightingale was currently undergoing repairs in a dark, classified orbital dock, waiting silently in the shadows for the next time a world stopped spinning and the dark began to close in. And somewhere out in the cold, unforgiving expanse of deep space, the universe knew with absolute certainty that as long as humanity drew breath, there would always be one ship, and only one ship, that never turned back. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.